Hi folks, it's been a while since I've talked about books on my channel, so I thought I would do a bit of a roundup of the reading I did in 2024 before we're too far into 2025. I'm not going to talk about all the books, just going to give a kind of top 10 or top 5 in various categories. So I did read 81 books in 2024. That sounds like a lot, but some of these are graphic novels which can be read in like a day or two. So I really only did read 28 novels that are intended for adults. So that's enough, I think, to pull a top 10 list out of. Let's do that first, and then maybe make another video or two of the other categories, which would be graphic novels, non-fiction, and middle grade fiction. But just books for adults for now. So my top 10, starting with number 10, would be Heretics of Dune by Frank Herbert, published in 1984. This is the 5th book out of 6 that Frank Herbert wrote in the Dune sequence. So how do I talk about this one without giving spoilers? Well, it's set thousands of years after Dune. So everybody you know and love is gone, except one person, and that would be Duncan Idaho, whom you may remember from the original Dune novel or movie, if you've seen the movie. Duncan Idaho was played by Jason Momoa, is that his name? That character from the Dune movie. Almost doing a blank on the name there. So he is a military leader, a close friend of Paul Atreides, and it's not like he's in all the Dune books right up to the 5th one. He does appear in the 4th one. He's important in the 4th one, in God Emperor of Dune. But it's a different Duncan Idaho there than it was in the 1st book. And it's a different Duncan Idaho now. In the 5th book, it's a teenage Duncan Idaho. And that's because there's a technology in the Dune universe that allows you to resurrect people as something called a Ghola, Ghola. So Duncan Idaho is a Ghola. He's a copy of the original, not the original. And he's a teenager, and he has to go through a ritual to recover his ancestral memories. So there's all kinds of strange things in Dune. You know, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood naturally have all the ancestral memories of all the previous witches who came before them. So they've hundreds or maybe thousands of years of memories inside a single person. Yeah, Dune gets very strange in all sorts of ways. So a teenage Duncan Idaho who has all the memories of the Duncan Idahos that went before him. He is central to Heretics of Dune. And we learn a lot in this book about the sisterhood. It's only kind of mentioned in passing in the 1st novel. We just can't get sort of sketchy information. There's an awful lot more about it in this, and we see their homeworld and everything. It might be interesting to reread the 1st book, knowing what we can know from the later books, but well, that'll be somewhere down the line if I do that. The other interesting thread in this novel is there's a young girl who is able to summon worms, you know, the big giant sandworms. She's able to summon them, and she can literally stand in front of its gigantic open mouth and it will not eat her. Right? So how is this possible? Well, that goes back to things that happened in God Emperor of Dune, which I can't talk about, but that's a thing. So this girl and Duncan Idaho are destined to meet and their stories converge. It's an interesting story. That's all I'll say about it. Dune gets weird. It always was weird. It gets even weirder as the books go on. They are worth reading at this stage. I've heard mixed reports about the later Dune novels. They're still really good novels. Not as good, I would say, as the original trilogy. Still really worth reading, though. So, in 10th place, then, that was Heretics of Dune. In 9th place, it's a tiny little book called The Quatermass Experiment, written in 1959 by Nigel Kneale. Now, you may have heard of the movie The Quatermass Experiment, which is the first of the Quatermass movies. Before that, it was a television serial in 6 parts, but most of those episodes are lost. Just like the BBC lost some Doctor Who episodes from antiquity, or maybe deliberately deleted them because they didn't value them, I'm not sure. But anyway, we only have 1 or 2 episodes of this. So literally, if you want to experience the original Quatermass experiment in full, the only way to do it is to read this book, which is the script. It's not a proper novelization. Nigel Kneale is the original writer of the script, and he's down as the author of this book because it is just the script with some changes to make it more palatable to regular readers. But I guess novelizations weren't really a thing back then. If they had been, I think he would have written a novelization. There are 4 of these books corresponding to the 4 series of Quatermass. The final one is a novelization, which is maybe written, I don't want to say, I'm not sure, but it could be written like 10 or 20 years later. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's a script, but it reads very well. It was a very talky television serial, what I saw of it. So it reads quite well as a script. And I just think it's valuable. It's more valuable than most novelizations because we no longer have the original. And the movie, which I decided to watch after reading this, is really cut down and kind of has a botched ending, which is nowhere near as good as the ending of this little book. So if you like Quatermass, it's worth checking this one out. In 8th place, published in 2009, is He is Legend, an anthology edited by Christopher Conlon. Now, this particular anthology has a theme, which you can probably guess from the title. I Am Legend is probably Richard Matheson's most well-known and well-admired book. I certainly like it. It's probably in my top 10 reads of all time. And I really like Richard Matheson as a writer, especially as a short story writer. So he's dead and gone, but what we have here are are stories that feel like they are written by Richard Matheson. And in many cases, they are direct sequels to stories that Matheson has written, or heavily inspired by stories that Matheson has written. One of them is actually a prequel to I Am Legend, which has Robert Neville and Ben Cortman. And it's more of a kind of, it goes into their previous relationship before the start of that book. And it's a story about marital infidelity. This is kind of strange. The stories are kind of hit and miss. Some are forgettable, and I have forgotten some already. But the really standout one is the opener, which is called Throttle, written by Stephen King and his son Joe Hill. And it is inspired by Duel. It's novella length, so it's the longest one in the book. It's inspired by Duel, which you may not have read the Richard Matheson story. You may not have even known this was a Richard Matheson story, but you've probably heard of the Steven Spielberg film Duel, which is based on this story. The movie about the big, dirty old truck trundling through the twisty roads of the Nevada desert, chasing this poor guy in a car. Remember that movie? Well, that's a Richard Matheson story. And Throttle is heavily inspired by it. This time it is a dingy old truck chasing a motorcycle gang, Hell's Angels style motorcycle gang. You might think, well, that's not very original. You just changed the car for some motorcycles. It's actually brilliant. And the brilliance is in the twist in the tale, where we learn the motivation of the truck driver, right? And it really makes the story. And it's this story alone, really, that catapulted this into my top 10. The others I could take or leave, but this is a brilliant story called Throttle. In 7th place, we have Lamb by Bonnie Nadzam, written in 2012. Now, I've never read this author before. I've never heard of this author before I first encountered the movie adaptation of this novel. And I liked the movie so much I decided to track down the novel and read it and see how it compared. Tricky one to talk about this. It's sort of a difficult subject matter. So I'll just sort of set the scene for you as to what this is about. So there's a guy called David Lamb, hence the title of the book, and his marriage has fallen apart. His father has just died, and he's not really in a great place psychologically. And one day he's just sitting in a parking lot, as they say in America, or a car park, as we say here, around some stores, and he's having a smoke, sitting on the back of his car, or truck, I think it is. And this 11-year-old girl comes up to him, and she's obviously been skipping school, and her friends are over in the corner. And she says, can I have a cigarette? And he asks, did your friends put you up to this? And she goes, yeah. So they start to strike up an unconventional friendship. And he encounters her here over a number of days, and they get talking, and he learns about her disadvantaged kind of life with her mother and her mother's boyfriend. And he starts to really feel for her, and that she's never going to have any life better than knowing this sort of urban squalor that she's in. So he invites her to take a road trip with him, right? Not telling her mother about it. They'll just get in the truck and they'll go. And he wants to take her on a road trip and show her the American countryside over hundreds of miles, and give her an experience that she can take with her the rest of her life and be unforgettable. And they'll go to a cabin which he owns, a remote cabin. And you might be thinking you know where this is going. But no, it doesn't really go there. His interest in her is purely of a fatherly fashion, and she lacks decent parenting, so she's happy to let him fill that role in her life for a little while. Now, the morality of this whole thing is, of course, really suspect, even without any sort of sexual element creeping into it. And that's kind of just what makes the book fascinating. It's about a relationship between an adult and a child, and we just are taken through it as the reader, and we wonder what's going to happen next. We wonder, is this all going to go down some terrible road? What's going to happen? And the author just doesn't judge it, and we're just invited to come on this experience with these two people, and it does make for fascinating reading. You don't completely, well, I don't anyway, completely identify with David Lamb in any sort of sympathetic way. I mean, what he did was nuts. Just, the girl's mother is probably going absolutely spare, wondering what's happened to her daughter during the week or so that they're away. Does he bring her back in the end? What happens? Not going to spoil it. It's just a book and a movie. It's a really good movie too. I've never quite read anything like it, and I think it's worth reading. So then we are up to, what are we on now? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Book number 6 in my little top 10 is The Bad Seed, written in 1954 by William March. I think this is the origin of the phrase, the bad seed, if you've ever heard that expression. So what we're talking here about is psychopathic children, or a psychopathic child, a girl in this case, which is a real thing, we now know. And the phrase the bad seed kind of hints that there may be a genetic side to this, that you are this way because of the person who came before you, because of your mother or father or someone in your ancestry. So this is a story about a girl who just is totally manipulative and doesn't regard other people as valuable and doesn't feel anything for them. And her whole life is a mimicry of other people's feelings so that she can get her way. And she becomes the suspect in the murder of a boy in her class at school. That's all I'll say about it. After reading it, I tracked down the original black and white movie, which is a fairly close adaptation of the book. It's a pretty daring movie for the 1950s. It was also remade very recently, starring McKenna Grace, that nerdy girl from Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, and the one that came before that, what did you call it? You know who I'm talking about. I can definitely see why they picked her, because she has that kind of aloofness about her, that she's not quite like everybody else. So to pick her for a psychopath was probably good. It's a good movie. It departs more from the original story, and I think it's Rob Lowe plays her father. But it's still a really good movie to watch. I enjoyed it, and I don't like an awful lot of movies that are made recently because of all of the woke political content, but I did quite like that one. So the book, The Bad Seed, that was my number 6. In number 5 now, we're going straight for space opera, and this is Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn. It is the first novel in the expanded universe of Star Wars, which came about after Return of the Jedi. This was 1991. It was an instant bestseller because the public were so hungry for more Star Wars. It probably would have been a bestseller even if it was a terrible book, because the Star Wars franchise was so successful. That original trilogy is just, if you grew up in the 80s, Star Wars, you know. But is it any good? Yes, it is. I thought it was a very good story. Darth Vader's dead. We have a new antagonist called Grand Admiral Thrawn, who is this blue-skinned, red-eyed humanoid that wears this white suit. He has taken over the dying remnants of the old Empire. Meanwhile, the New Republic is trying to find its feet, and Princess Leia is involved. Han, Lando Calrissian, Luke, they're all involved. All the old familiar characters are there, and we have a good old space opera full of political shenanigans and whatnot. And Thrawn is quite different from Vader. He's got nothing to do with the Force. He's just a regular person. But there's an interesting creature they've introduced called the Islamari. And these Islamari, they're these tree-dwelling creatures that only live on a particular planet, but they have the innate ability to push back the Force. So if you have one of the Islamari near you, no one can use the Force against you within a certain sort of range of distance. So that's an interesting way of protecting yourself from people who are Jedi, whether dark or light. So that isn't used to great effect in Book 1, Heir to the Empire. This is the first book in a new trilogy. But I'm guessing it's going to be used later on. The best way to experience this book, in my opinion, is to get the audiobook on Audible, which is narrated by Mark Thompson, who makes a brilliant job of mimicking the voices of Han Solo, Calrissian, and all the rest, especially C-3PO. C-3PO really sounds like Anthony Daniels. But they all sound kind of 90 to 95% like the people you remember, and there was never any confusion about who was speaking as I was listening to it. It also has the sound effects that are very familiar to us and little musical interludes here and there that really make you feel immersed in the Star Wars universe that you know. So I went on many long walks just listening to this and enjoying being pulled back into that whole universe. And part of the reason why I read this was because I wanted to try and erase the abomination that is Disney Star Wars from my mind. I've given up on it entirely. I have watched the new movies that came out in the last decade, but I haven't liked much of it, and I think it's all being mishandled. And so as far as I'm concerned, Heir to the Empire, which is set 5 years after Return of the Jedi, and brings back all our old characters while they're still young, this is the real sequel as far as I'm concerned. Even if it's no longer officially the real sequel, I don't care. I'm going to treat it as the real sequel to Star Wars and forget about everything else. So now my number 4 book is the beginning of another trilogy. This book is called Wool by Hugh Howey, and it came out in 2012. It's recently been made into a television series by Apple called Silo. I did catch season 1 prior to reading this, and I liked it so much that's the reason why I decided to read the book. I thought this book was going to be beat for beat the same as season 1 of Silo, and then season 2 would probably be book 2, which is called Shift. But no, actually, I was halfway through reading this when I had already reached the end of season 1, so it was really nice for me to get the second half of the book completely fresh, having never watched it. The series 2 wasn't out at that point. but it looks from the trailer like it does follow the second half of Wool. So this is a post-apocalyptic story set after the end of the world. The whole world is decimated. Nothing lives up top. The only people who are alive are existing in a gigantic silo underground. So there's a big spiral staircase spanning over 100 floors. The whole thing is kept going by a massive generator somewhere way down below in what's called the down deep. And everything's getting a little worse year upon year. And the generator is getting harder and harder to maintain, and life is getting more and more threatened. Meanwhile, people are wondering if we're being lied to about up top. Even though you can see it, the very top layer is a cafeteria that gives you a camera view of outside, immediately outside, where we see like an old rotting tree and just rocks everywhere and the remains of an old city in the distance. And that's about all you can see. Now, occasionally people do go out. When they've committed a crime and they're forced outside, they're given a suit which is only going to protect them for about 10 minutes or so. And out they go with the instructions, we hope, even though you're being punished, we hope that you will clean for us. So they're given this wool, hence the title of the book, and with the instructions, please clean the camera lens because dust and grime starts to obscure everything. But they can choose to clean it or choose not to clean it. And you almost exclusively, everybody chooses to clean the lens. Now it's an interesting play on words. I mean, wool sounds like a bit of a lame title for a book. It's called wool because they've got wool, but it's also called wool because the question is the wool being pulled over your eyes? So I really like this. I've already bought volumes 2 and 3, which is Shift and Dust, and I'm looking forward to reading at least one of those later this year, probably sooner rather than later. Yeah, so that gives you a sense of what Wool is about. It's well worth reading. My number 3 book is Mystery Walk, written in 1983 by Robert McCammon. I first read McCammon when I was a teenager, and it was a short story collection called Blue World, which kind of blew me away. Haha. It's a really good short story collection, right up there with Night Shift and Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. And I always intended to read more Robert McCammon, and for one reason or another, I just never got around to it until about the last 3 years. I've now purchased almost every book that he has brought out in ebook, and I've read about 10 of them or so. He has never let me down, I gotta say. And this one is one of the really good ones, Mystery Walk. It's an early work for him, probably his fifth or sixth novel or something like that. But he's got about 23 or 4 of them out at this point. So Mystery Walk is about this teenager who has some kind of supernatural ability to see the spirits of the dead and to help them on their way. His mother is American Indian, and this ability seems to have come down genetically through that line in his family. His father is a Christian man who believes all this kind of stuff is satanic, and he doesn't like it. Meanwhile, we've got another story happening elsewhere of another boy around the same age who seems to have some sort of ability to heal creatures. He healed an animal when he was very young, and his father, who was a Christian evangelist, decided to start a ministry based around his son, one of those tent revival ministries that goes from place to place, and he puts his son out as a healer. But the son isn't convinced that he really has any ability. And we go on from there. And sooner or later, the stories of these two boys are going to intersect and things are going to happen. So that gives you a sense of how Mystery Walk. Mystery Walk means, that phrase Mystery Walk is finding out what you're supposed to do with your life. You know, your life is a mystery. What are you here to do? That's the Mystery Walk. Book number 2 in my list of top 10 is another oldie but goodie. It's Firestarter, written in 1980 by Stephen King. I've read 52 Stephen King books at this point. That sounds like a lot, but he's written over 80 of them. Maybe it's even over 90 at this point. So I've read a lot of the old stuff, and I'm trying to sort of fill in the gaps so that I can read at least everything up until the year 2000 I'll have read, and then it'll be a bit scattered after that. But Firestarter, is it one of the good ones or one of the bad ones? Well, it's one of the really good ones. It's essentially a father-daughter road trip while they are being pursued by some nasty government agents. And both of these people were originally part of an experiment. Well, no, the father was part of an experiment by this nefarious government group called the Shop, where they were doing experiments on people to try and stimulate psychic ability. So Charlie, the child, is the product of two of the people from that experiment, and she's sort of, her own psychic abilities are really amped up. So she can start fires very, very easily just by thinking about it. And these two people, the mother's out of the picture at this point. These two people, father and daughter, are on the run, and all kinds of things are going to happen while they're on the run. The movie that was made starring Drew Barrymore is a very faithful adaptation of the book. I would say the book is better. There's a bit more going on in it, especially with the character Rainbird. We get a lot more of his sort of backstory and motivations and everything. It fleshes him out quite a bit. The modern remake is fairly forgettable, I have to say. But yeah, Stephen King's Firestarter, well worth reading if you're reading old Stephen King. Don't miss this one out. My number one read is The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum, written in 1989. So I've never read Jack Ketchum, but I knew that this book was sort of notorious for being a disturbing read. And I heard that it is based, loosely at least, on some kind of real case that happened. So let me put you in the picture. And the picture is not what this book cover that you're seeing up that way. It's not what this book cover. The book cover is terrible. I don't know what the artist was thinking. Okay, the girl next door is not a cheerleader. I don't know why there's a skull face. Is that supposed to indicate that she is dead or something? No, let me put you in the picture. Right, so we're looking at, it's set, I think, in the 1950s or thereabouts, which is described by the author as a time of curious repressions. He uses an expression, something like that, which I thought was interesting, because we all know that repressing things tends to cause very nasty psychological reactions in human beings. So the 50s on the surface might look like it's all, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? White picket fences, you know what I mean? Everything's much better than it is now. But it was a time of heavy sexual repression, we have to remember. So there's this woman, I forget her name, it doesn't matter, but she's the villain of the piece, right? There's this woman, and she's raising 4 boys on her own. And this story is told from the perspective of a boy that lives next door to this woman and her kids. Now, enter 2 girls. They have been in a car accident with their parents. Their parents are dead. And the girls are now coming to stay forever with their aunt, who is this woman who's raising the 4 boys, right? So she's raising them on her own. She's resentful of the fact that she's got no husband with her. He's ran off, I think. And now she has to deal with 2 girls in addition to her 4 boys and all the problems it might bring to her household, bringing girls into it with boys. So this causes her to be rather cruel to the girl in the story. Now, although it's 2 girls, the story is really about one of them, the pretty one, you might say. The other one probably would be pretty, except she's lumbered with these leg braces and has trouble getting around, and she came off pretty bad in the car accident, whereas the other girl just has a little bit of scarring here and there. But the cruelty starts to escalate, and as the book moves forward, that cruelty escalates to a jaw-dropping degree. Now, the boy next door spends quite a bit of time over with the four boys in that household, but he starts to watch them all get influenced negatively by their mother, and they all join her in the cruelty that she is inflicting, and they join her with a remarkable kind of ease. And this boy from the other house, he is in real danger of becoming a participant, but he somehow manages to, as it were, hang on to his own soul. If he had been one of those boys living in that house, it's quite possible that he wouldn't have. So part of what's going on in this novel is just how easy it is, especially if you're young, to slip into sadism, if you like. I would be aware, you see, psychologically, that we all have a kind of a monster deep down inside us. And I don't think evil is a spiritual thing. I think it's a genetic thing. It comes from our evolutionary past when we were essentially reptiles. We've still got the reptilian brain in the center of our head, surrounded by other regions of the brain that allow for things like compassion and even just simple things like the ability to take care of your own offspring, which all came layered over the reptilian brain as we evolved into mammals, then into primates. That's a whole other story. But there's a monster inside us all, right? We don't just get to go, there's the monster. It's in us all. Most of us have kept it buried pretty deep, so it just never influences our lives. But it can be brought out. So we're looking at the corruption of these young men by their own mother. And psychologically, this is quite a deep book. A very intelligently written book. Although it is violent, the violence does not seem gratuitous because the author has something he's trying to communicate here. There is an afterword which is worth reading that lets you into his thoughts as to why he wrote this book. So yeah, it's not a book that everyone will like. You have to be able to take it. You have to be able to take what's happening in it. It was not a fun read for me. I had to stop reading every now and again and just go on to other books and then eventually pick it up. And I got to a point where I just said to myself, look, you're never going to finish this unless you just knuckle down and get it done. So I forced myself just to read the rest of it. And it seems strange to put a book that I forced myself to read as my #1 book of the year. But that's because it's like nothing I've ever read before, and it's going to stay with me. And the key moment for me was sort of, there was a point in the book, and I'm trying to say this without spoilers, there's a point in the book where I just suddenly stopped and went, no, not that, don't do that. And I just, because can't say what I want to say because it's just going to be spoilers. And that was the moment I realized I am so invested in what is actually happening here, which just made me realize this author is brilliant at characters. It's rare that I am just so heavily invested in these people, especially the girl, as real people. And that means that's why my book is the #1 book of the year. But you won't enjoy it. If you're a human being, you won't enjoy it, but it is worth reading. Okay, so that's my top 10. I'll make another video for graphic novels and middle grade and whatnot. But for now, that's my top 10 fiction reads of 2024. See ya.